Today we're going to talk about homicide as a situated transaction, understanding Luckenbill's theory. When people think about homicide, they often imagine a sudden, uncontrollable explosion of violence, a moment where someone snaps, but criminology has long challenged that idea. In 1977, sociologist David F. Luckenbill introduced a powerful alternative perspective: homicide as a situated transaction. Rather than focusing only on offenders' traits or backgrounds, Luckenbill argued that many homicides unfold through structured social interactions, governed by norms, expectations, and escalating choices made by both parties in a specific situation. This interaction is organized as what he explicitly terms a character contest, drawing directly on Irving Goffman. Luckenbill describes this interaction as a confrontation in which opponents seek to establish or maintain face at the other's expense by remaining steady in the face of adversity. Such transactions additionally involved a consensus among participants that violence was a suitable if not required means for settling the contest. Fully articulated, this process represents 6 stages. To elaborate on those, we'll further break down what situated transaction theory is, how it explains homicide events more specifically, and discuss what more recent research tells us about its continued relevance. Luckenbill's central claim is simple but radical. Many homicides are not random or purely emotional acts. They are the outcome of escalating social exchanges. Key elements required include a face-to-face interaction, 2 or more individuals, where each person's actions shape the other's responses, and that occurs within a context governed by social norms, especially norms related to honor, respect, and retaliation. Importantly, homicide is not assumed to be inevitable at the start. Instead, it emerges when participants fail or refuse to de-escalate. This shifts the analytic focus from what kind of person commits homicide to how do interactions spiral into lethal outcomes? Let's review briefly what a situated transaction is. Luckenbill states, the transaction took a sequential form. The victim issued what the offender deemed an offensive move. The offender typically retaliated with a verbal or physical challenge. A working agreement favoring the use of violence was forged with the victim's response, and the battle ensued, leaving the victim dead or dying. The manner of the offender's exiting was shaped by his relationship to the victim and the moves of his audience. Admittedly, that was a lot to take in. We'll now look at these stages and context in a more fine-grained way. Stage 1 concerns the victim's opening move. The transaction begins with an action that the eventual offender defines as offensive. This move may be verbal, physical, or symbolic, and it may occur during the homicidal encounter itself or be reintroduced from a prior interaction. What matters is not the victim's intent, but that the action is experienced as a threat to face, honor, or standing within the situation. Examples include insults and disrespect, jealousy such as that arising from a romantic rivalry, status threats, or public humiliation. Stage 2 concerns the offender interpretation of the event. In every case, the offender interprets the victim's move as intentional and personally offensive. This interpretation may be reinforced through prior rehearsals between the parties, statements from bystanders, or direct exchanges with the victim. At this stage, the interaction is transformed into what Luckenbill describes as a character contest. At this stage, backing down risks loss of face. This is the point of perceived disrespect. This is the meaning-making stage by the offender where escalation is driven by interpretation, not objective harm. The third stage covers offender retaliation. Here, the offender responds with a retaliatory move designed to restore face and demonstrate resolve. This response typically takes the form of a verbal challenge, a threat, or physical aggression short of lethal violence. By retaliating rather than disengaging, the offender signals that backing down is not an acceptable option within the situation. Stage 4 involves the victim response and the working agreement. At this stage, the offender's challenge places the victim in a consequential position, either withdraw and risk loss of face or respond in kind. In cases that proceed to homicide, victims respond in ways that accept violence as a legitimate means of resolving the contest through continued defiance, physical retaliation, or counter-threats. This is the hinge point of the theory. At this point, a working agreement is forged between the parties that violence is an appropriate way to settle the interaction. Stage 5 deals with the parties' commitment to battle and the mobilization of weapons. Here, once the working agreement is established, both people become committed to battle. It is at this stage, not earlier, that weapons typically enter the interaction. At this point, offenders often leave the scene to obtain a weapon or convert objects at hand into weapons. It is the availability and mobilization of weapons that drastically narrow opportunities for de-escalation and make lethal outcomes far more likely. Stage 6 of the theory describes the termination and exit from the lethal encounter. To Luckenbill, homicide does not end with the fatal act itself. The final stage involves how the transaction is terminated and how the offender exits the situation. Exit behavior, whether fleeing, remaining at the scene, or contacting authorities, is shaped by the relationship between offender and victim and by the reactions of the audience. Bystanders may be supportive, hostile, or shocked, and their responses influence how the event concludes socially as well as physically. It's important to recognize that this theory still matters today. Luckenbill's core contribution, which stemmed from his analysis of 70 homicide transactions, was in identifying this sequential, interactional process, that homicides are often not a single impulsive act. This work was influential because it highlighted interactional dynamics, not just individual pathology. It also demonstrated that homicide often follows predictable social patterns, as well as showed how cultural norms around honor, masculinity, and retaliation matter. This perspective aligns closely with symbolic interactionism, micro-sociological theories of violence, and later situational and event-based criminology. Importantly, it helps explain why many homicides involve acquaintances, why disputes escalate quickly in unregulated spaces, and why alcohol, peer presence, and weapons dramatically increase risk. This brings us to what more recent research says. While Luckenbill's original study relied on court records and qualitative reconstruction, later research has largely supported his core insights, often with stronger data. Contemporary findings show that most homicides involve prior interaction, not ambush. It also shows that escalation sequences are observable in police narratives and video footage, and situational factors, such as audience presence, intoxication, and weapon availability, strongly predict lethal outcomes. Further, research using police incident reports, ethnographic observation, and video analysis of violent encounters has reinforced the idea that homicide is often a process, not an impulse. At this point, it's important to briefly mention where Luckenbill's work stands among theories of homicide. Recent work on urban violence, nightlife aggression, and gun violence continues to confirm that micro-level interactional dynamics play a critical role, especially in disputes involving status threats. However, scholars also note limitations, including that not all homicides fit this model, such as those involving instrumental reasons or domestic killings. Further, the theory doesn't explicitly address the role of structural factors, including poverty, segregation, and firearm prevalence, and how they shape which situations arise in the first place. Still, situated transaction theory remains one of the most enduring frameworks for understanding how violence unfolds in real time. Luckenbill's theory reminds us that homicide is rarely just about rage or evil. It is often about interaction, meaning, and social pressure. By focusing on escalation, decision points, and situational context, criminology gains tools not only to explain homicide but to prevent it. Understanding violence as a situated transaction means recognizing where interventions, de-escalation, and environmental changes can save lives before the final stage is reached. If you found this video interesting, please share it. It's free. And, if you're doing research or just have a general interest in criminology or criminal justice, follow and subscribe to the channel. Further information and source references are always in the video descriptions.